Hello, I'm Julie Swenson, Managing Director of Forward Theater Company in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Mike Fisher, Milwaukee-based theater writer and dramaturg.
I'm Jen Uphoff-Gray, founder and artistic director of Forward Theater Company. And this is Theater Forward, a twice-monthly conversation about theater from a local, regional, and national perspective. From Madison to Manhattan, we're excited to share insight into our own company while exploring issues surrounding theater in the Midwest and around the country. Welcome to episode 66 of Theater Forward.
All right, good to
Drive
be
that
here.
highway.
Yes. So this week, we are going to talk about budgets. They are the most definitive expression of a company's values in my mind, yet how often do we get to see them and understand them? They're also honestly really difficult to put together even under quote unquote normal circumstances, which we are most certainly still not in. So in this conversation, we are just going to dive into all things budgetary. And honestly, this conversation is kind of prompted by something that we did here at Forward this fall. And credit where credit is due, inspired by Santa Cruz Shakespeare. So we have always aimed for budget transparency here at Forward. And in fact, as a sort of additional step, last year when we were creating an updated EDI and anti-racism plan, we committed to putting our full budget on our website for transparency. But then thanks to the often joys of theater Twitter, where I can find fabulous, exciting new practices from colleagues around the country, a dramaturg I know shared that Santa Cruz Shakespeare had put their operating budget into their playbill. And I was really struck by that and the transparency of that and the accessibility of that and the communication with your audience of where you put your money and where their money goes when they buy a ticket or make a donation. So we did that. We printed our budget right there in the playbill for the first show of our fall season, which just closed a few days ago. And we got really good feedback from people who were really fascinated to start to understand why professional theater costs what it costs. And where that money goes. So it was a really positive experience, I think, for us. And our discussions about it led us to decide to talk about budgets for this podcast episode.
Well, you'll see in our budget, the majority of our money goes to what, in the big umbrella term, people. And that's staff, and that's our actors and designers and all people doing lectures, on and on. That goes directly into their pocketbook. It's interesting that we're having this conversation in 2021, and that this is, in my mind, a cause for celebration. That we put our money goes to people, to hiring people, because there was a time. Do you remember this, when the nonprofits of the world were getting such criticism for paying their CEOs and their staff basically a living wage? Because it was supposed to be like under 10%, 15%, and oh my gosh, you've done a very poor job of your on your budget. And I think I am hoping that those days are gone, because we have received such positive feedback from people who saw our budget and said, that is great. The money is going exactly where I want it to go, in the productions and the people.
Right. Although to build on that, there's the idea too, that by being more transparent with budgets, it comes with it some more transparency about pay levels, because I think you're right. The shaming of paying people a living wage, an appropriate wage for the work that they do in the nonprofits and in the nonprofit arts world, is like, we really need to let go of that. This idea that overhead should be so low. The overhead is what lets you provide the service, right?
Right.
But we also, I don't want to be seeing companies where a CEO is making, where the artistic director or the managing director is making 10 times what one of their artists on stage is making.
Right.
We are not making anything close to that, Julie and I.
We're good. We're good there.
But I think salary transparency it's not just an ethical thing. It's an equity thing. People need to be able to talk about what they're getting paid and to share it. And that's how you can root out inequity in the field.
Well, a shout out to piggyback off of what Jen just said to Lauren Halverson, the Washington, D.C. based dramaturg, who's Nothing for the Group. That's Nothing for the Group, folks. Free newsletter, although there's also a subscriber version. You really should sign up for it. It's filled with fantastic, fantastic theater news every week. And what she's, for at least the last couple of months now, maybe even longer, has started running a feature where she talks about the particular positions of theater companies, all of whom will remain nameless on this broadcast, who are not paying for a particular position the living wage of the city in which those people work. Which raises, I mean, that's a sort of shaming I'm 100% in favor of, because people should be paid at least the living wage. Having said that, theater companies, nonprofits, a lot of them don't have a lot of money. And so one of the real questions that comes up for me as part of this budget transparency, and this is a dialogue with an audience, is what do you do when a theater company doesn't have or doesn't feel as though it has the money to pay for a particular person to make a living wage? I mean, do you go ahead and advertise the position anyway? Do you recalibrate what the theater company is going to do and how it does it? I don't have the answers to those questions. I think it just puts them on the table to think about in the way that this budget transparency does.
It's a beautiful conversation, and it's a conversation that has never happened before, because I think there is like nuns and monks. We in the theater industry have signed up for some sort of vow of poverty. And I'm very happy that is being questioned now, because I do look at those. I'll have to be honest. I look at that Nothing for the Group, and this literary assistant is not being paid anywhere near what a living wage is in that city. And I think, well, yeah, right. They usually don't. And it's gotten my mind to start thinking, but why is that? Why have we for so many years accepted that they don't get paid a living wage? And I think she is adding on to that conversation, and it's great to have. Why do we expect people in the theater industry and the performing arts and nonprofit to work for under a living wage in the community that they live in?
Well, and to go back to your question, Mike, about whether it should or should not be allowable. This is one of those conversations where what we really need is nuance, which is not always
right.
An easy thing. But I do think context matters. I mean, again, since the whole point of this conversation is about transparency. So when Forward Theater started, we're in our 13th season now. No, we weren't paying a living wage for our city in our first couple of seasons. We weren't. We were building something from nothing. And a lot of artists in our community wanted to help build something from nothing for the prospect of longer term employment. And what we were able to promise people is, this is what we've got now, and we promise wages go up the year after that, and they go up the year after that. And I think it was around our 5th season or so that we started paying what I would consider a living wage, and it's continued to go up from there. If we had to start our company with every single employee, carpenters, actors, staff, making a minimum of, say, $15 an hour, I don't know if we could have gotten the company completely off the ground. But if we had gotten past season 5 or 6 and weren't paying a living wage, then we haven't figured it out, and we should either change or stop. Honestly, in my opinion. And that's why I say nuance. If I were to see a company that's getting up off the ground and know they're not paying those rates, but there's a commitment for us, there's a swift trajectory upward planned, people can make the decision whether or not to take that work. But I do think a company that's been around a decade or 2 decades, or some of the ones getting called out by Nothing for the Group 5 decades, are still not paying a living wage. I'm with you. I think shaming is not inappropriate, because if you haven't figured out how to compensate people for their work by then, you're doing it wrong.
Well, and what I love about, yes, that's exactly right. And again, I think in terms of engendering conversation, which is what Forward Publishing, its budget is all about, that allows you to have that conversation. So if artists are going to make the choice in years 2, 3, and 4 to work for less than a quote unquote living wage, or to give back some of their time and talent. At least it's on the table what's going on, and everybody is in agreement, and there's a consensus built around it. This goes back to one of our very first podcasts where we talked about whether artists should work events, benefit events, for example, without being paid. And I think, again, and this is something that's been missing in the discussion in the last 2 years about that, it's not an either or. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, which is what I argued then. The important point is that there is an open and transparent conversation with the people whose time and talent is being asked of, that it's handled in a way where asymmetrical power relationships aren't used to keep them from getting work if they say no, where they're free to say no, and where you are having that kind of conversation. It also means, going back, since Julie brought up literary managers and dramaturgs of the world unite, we're always underpaid, but it forces you to ask a hard question. So for example, maybe a production can only afford an intimacy designer or a dramaturg for a particular show. It can pay one of them a living wage. It can't pay two. And then the discussion becomes, do we pay two people under minimum wage, under living wage? Or do you pay one person a living wage? And there you're being forced to make hard decisions, which are good for a company to think through about whether in a production of a Neil LaBute play, maybe it's more important to have an intimacy designer than a dramaturg. In a production like The Amateurs, which Forward will be launching soon, and yes, I am the dramaturg for that, so this is self-interested, but that's a play that's dealing with the medieval period in world history. Maybe in that one, having a dramaturg is more important than having an intimacy designer. And again, at least you can have the conversation.
Hard decisions, that's exactly what making a budget is. Every single choice is a choice. Well, if I can pay more people at less per person, I can pay fewer people, but they get more. I mean, we can have a dramaturg or we can have an intimacy coordinator. I mean, that is the entire budgeting process. And I'll say, part of what helped us get buy-in and investment from the artists who helped make this company possible in those early years was part of our transparency was favored nations across the board. So every designer who worked with us in a given season made the same. Every equity actor that worked with us, and that is still our policy. This is the sort of maximum that we can, responsibly budget in this season. Everyone's going to make the same. So you aren't looking around and going, that actor over there, my castmate, is worth more to the company than I am, or this company values scenic designers more than costume designers, or et cetera, et cetera. And there are definite downsides or complications to that policy. Some artists aren't able to work for us for what we can afford to pay, and that is completely understandable and not held against them. And we've gone back to people in subsequent seasons when our rates have gone up and been able to bring them in. But I also really appreciate it because it means that younger and oftentimes more diverse emerging talent comes in at a comparable living wage to the more established talent. And that feels really good to us. I get that it doesn't work for every company, but we've seen a lot of benefits in terms of building a real sense of community with our artists.
In the development of the budget too, I wanted, since this is, a podcast for people who would love to start their own budgeting, we get input, Jen, you and I start that budget, but then every one of the staff members puts in numbers for their department, have a say in that, goes to, our board, our finance committee, our board, development committee. And so there are a lot of eyes on that budget. It's not one person determining where the resources are going and how much we expect resources to be, but there's a lot of input.
And it's so daunting because like I said at the beginning, even in a best case, quote unquote, normal year, creating a budget for a nonprofit arts organization, it really is just creating your best guess, right? You're making your best guess of what you think things are going to cost and your best guess of what you're going to bring in from revenue sources. And sometimes some of those things are known, like you have a 3-year lease and you know what your office space is going to cost to the dollar every month you've got a lease. Other things are more unexpected, and you have to kind of adjust on the fly. And so you create this budget, and it's a best guess. And you get better and better at it over the years. As you learn to anticipate the ebbs and flows of things, you can figure out, what, the landlord, they've been really consistent. They go up 3% a year. Great. So we're going to guess it's going to go up 3% next year. But my goodness, this past period of time, because I don't think anybody has good guesses or had good guesses as this pandemic began of what was going to happen, because none of us have lived through anything like this. So our best guesses were just so wild in many occasions, because we had nothing to make those, if it's an educated guess, what are you educating yourself with? We didn't have anything concrete to base that on. And even now, 18 plus months into this, it's things are still so fluid and up in the air. Do we need to continue testing, as part of our equity contracts? A few months ago, the answer was no. As of the day we're recording, now we do again. And do we have that money in the budget or don't we? Regardless, we have to spend the money, right? And things are changing so much more often during this time of crisis than in the before times, and it's hard.
Our producer for this podcast is also our director of marketing, and to do a budget to figure out what ticket sales will be coming out of this last season, and also with masks and vaccinations and I don't know. I don't know that I've ever responsibly guessed as much as we did with those ticket numbers. Will they come back? Subscribers, yes. At what percentage? Will we get single ticket buyers? Maybe for this show, maybe not for this, but man, that was a process. And nobody can be held to those numbers this year, because they were educated guesses as best we could at that time.
That raises a related issue, Julie. And maybe this is a place where Forward and other companies will go in the future in terms of what we're publishing in programs or transparency. But I think in terms of educating a public, seeing what's taken in per show could be very helpful for people. I know that there are wild turks out there, including yours truly, that want every single show to be by Beckett and Carol Churchill, and that ain't going to happen. It's just not going to happen, and it can't happen. But helping people understand and educating a public about the really difficult challenges that go into making a season and why it has to be balanced in some of the ways it is. I mean, certainly for me, being a part of the Forward family in the last 3 years, that has been educative process in terms of seeing how that works. Why might a company to choose a really fantastic play that is easily sort of thrown up there as just an old chestnut, like Steel Magnolias, being done both in Chicago and at Milwaukee Rep this year? I think it's a fantastic play. I can hardly wait to see both of those productions. But there are people who will say, well, but that's been there, done that. Why can't we choose something less sentimental and more adventuresome? Well, maybe we need a balance. And seeing those numbers might help people understand that, so that when they're just going off on, why, this company didn't do this show or that show or isn't doing more of whatever, they're making a decision which is informed by the real challenges that people like you, Jen, face in putting together a season.
Mm. Yeah, I think I think that's spot on, Mike. Everything is a choice. Everything is a choice when you're running an arts organization. What you do, what you spend your money on, and what you think, where you think the money will come from to pay for all of it. Do you do a show that's got a really expansive, has really expansive design needs? That's going to be very exciting. But then, if you're spending all that money on that, you may not have the money to do some other thing. Do you do the show you fall in love with 6 actors, or the one that you like almost as much that has 3? but maybe the one with 6 actors you think is one that will attract more single ticket buyers. So might actually wind up being the better financial choice as well as an artistic choice. I mean, everything is just building in so many factors. But what I really like about the trends in our field towards transparency is twofold. Number one, it holds all of us to higher ethical standards, right? So we don't obscure where the money goes. You can see what we spend on people. You can see what we spend on community outreach. You can see what we spend on equity related, not actors equity, but equity diversity related efforts, and choose to spend your money on a ticket or a donation with us or not. You can see if a company's values align with your own as well as their art. And I think that that's positive development. I think that in all things, we should be educated about the power of our dollar and voting with our dollars, right? So that's really important. But it's also, it empowers artists. It empowers artists to know their worth when they can know what other people are getting paid, whether at a particular organization or industry wide. And, this conversation, of course, makes me think about Karen Olivo and Eden Espinosa's organization, AFFECT, Artists for Economic Transparency, that they started during 2020 and is still going. Listeners to this podcast know that Karen is a friend of the pod, so to speak, and a member of our Forward Theater artistic community. And their work and their advocacy on behalf of artists to know their worth, to be educated about economic issues and advocating for themselves, but also for the transparency to know where the money you are helping an organization earn is going. And that too is important and powerful tool for artists. And for anyone who doesn't know anything about AFFECT, it's AFECT.org. I think it's worth checking out because for people working in industry and particularly people working in the commercial theater, because that's Karen and Eden's primary focus, it's so important. And an organization like that, to my knowledge, really didn't exist before this. And I think it's a really important step.
Sort of related to that, Jen, and this is another sort of admittedly touchy and difficult area, but it's one where I think Forward has again been fairly forward. One of the demands of We See You, White American Theater, is that you know where the board members in an organization work or where they come from, to get a better sense of where the money is coming from that helps support a theater and to help places make intelligent choices. I mean, there may be, some people may feel, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, that if a board member comes from, XYZ corporation that, runs a zillion sweatshops in Asia, maybe they don't want to be supporting a theater that's getting some of its money from a person that works for that corporation. Again, it's all about having a conversation. Different people are going to land on that in different places, but why not know where a place's money is coming from? I mean, I think it's a fair thing, even though we recognize that in a capitalist world, people don't always get a choice about where they work or how they're able to make contributions. I mean, all of us are conflicted and compromised.
Yeah, I think as long as we all can extend grace to artists and arts organizations to make the choices that they make, and then we can make our own choices. Back in the day when it seemed like every arts organization in America was funded by Philip Morris, and you could take issue with companies, right? And you could take issue with companies that took that money, but you can also acknowledge for the ones that did, that may be what allowed them to employ artists and create work. And so it's complicated. And I think it's important that we extend that grace to our colleagues and to the artists and everyone making those decisions. But more transparency, I think, is just an inherently better thing than less. And for people who are in a position to pick and choose what work they take, what companies they work for, what tickets they buy to which companies, what donations they make to which companies, having more information about how that money is spent and where it goes is a public good, bottom line.
I mean, the two
Absolutely.
words I keep hearing in this conversation are grace and nuance. And I think I'd like to
Yes.
think this podcast stands for the idea and ideal, as does our company, that there ought to be more of both. And that these kinds of publications, publishing this kind of information, hopefully helps advance the ball on both of those fronts.
Yeah, yeah, I certainly hope so. And we're just touching on a few aspects of
Right.
everything that goes into budgets, but this this part of the conversation, I think, is really timely and connected to a lot of other conversations happening in the field right now, and it feels really good to talk transparently about it. And I have a feeling we'll come back to future podcasts on the topic of budgeting and where the money goes. But I think this can be it for this particular episode of Theater Forward. I will say that's it for today. It's a conversation about theater in Wisconsin, the Midwest, and America. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jen Uphoff-Gray.
I'm Julie Swenson.
And I'm Mike Fisher. Our podcast is produced by the hardworking, can never be paid enough for his good work, Scott Hayden. And you can follow us and share your thoughts, please, on Facebook or on Twitter. I'm tongue-tied because I'm thinking about how always, people, theater is spelled with an E-R.
And if you enjoy this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you might tune in. And please leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
We are so grateful to have you listening, and we will be back soon for another Theater Forward conversation.